There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, their edges softened by the mundane fabric of a Tuesday evening or a Sunday morning. They don't announce themselves with thunder or trumpets. They slip in quietly, through the cracks in your routine, and only in retrospect do you see them for what they were. The subtle, almost imperceptible shifting of the tectonic plates of your entire world. For me, that moment smelled of sandalwood, citrus, and warm cotton. It smelled like us. I stood there in the low, humming light of our small laundry room, a space no bigger than a closet, holding one of my own t-shirts up to my face. It was warm from the dryer, a soft, comforting weight in my hands, and it carried a scent that was both mine and not mine. It was a fusion, an impossible and intimate blend of my quiet, earthy sandalwood body wash and Julian's sharp, bright, almost effervescent citrus one. It was the scent of our lives, accidentally, or perhaps purposefully, intertwined in the churning belly of a Maytag machine. This was the 5th time. The 5th week that our clothes, our fabrics, the very textiles that touched our skin had been washed together. And it had all started with a single, devastatingly simple sentence, a phrase that had lodged itself in my chest like a beautiful, painful splinter. "They smell better mixed together," he had said. And in that moment, the ordinary act of laundry became something else entirely. It became a ritual. It became a language. It became the most terrifying and hopeful thing in my life. To understand the weight of that simple cotton t-shirt, you have to understand Julian. And to understand Julian, you have to understand the architecture of our friendship, a structure I had spent 4 years carefully building and maintaining. We met in the most unglamorous way possible, a university housing lottery that paired a brooding, introverted photography student with a bright, boisterous computer science major. On paper, it was a disaster. I saw the world in shutter speeds and apertures, in the way light fell across a face to reveal a story. He saw the world in lines of code, in algorithms and elegant, logical solutions. I moved through life with the quiet patience of someone waiting for the perfect shot. Julian moved through it like he was trying to outrun a deadline, all kinetic energy and brilliant, chaotic smiles. Our first shared room was a study in contrasts. My side was a carefully curated landscape of Ansel Adams prints, stacks of photo books, and the quiet, metallic gleam of camera bodies. His side looked like a command center for a friendly invasion, covered in whiteboards filled with complex equations, dual monitors that were never off, and a perpetual collection of half-empty coffee mugs. It should have been a short, tense cohabitation. Instead, it became the foundation of everything. He was, from the very beginning, impossible to dislike. There was an earnestness to Julian, a genuine goodness that shone through his sometimes overwhelming energy. He would talk for hours about the beauty of a perfectly optimized sorting algorithm, his hands flying as he tried to explain the concepts, his eyes lit with a passion I recognized from my own obsession with light and shadow. I learned to listen, to find the rhythm in his technical monologues, and in return, he learned to respect my silence. He learned that when I was sitting by the window for an hour, staring at the way the evening sun turned the brick building across the quad to gold, I wasn't bored or sad. I was working. He learned to read my moods not from my words, which were few, but from the camera I chose to carry that day. A wide-angle lens meant I was feeling open, willing to take in the world. A macro lens meant I was turning inward, focusing on the small, overlooked details. He never said he noticed these things, but he did. I knew he did. He'd come home, glance at the 50mm prime I was cleaning, and say, "Tough day with people." It was his way of speaking my language. The crush, as it were, didn't arrive like a lightning strike. It was more like a slow developing process in a darkroom. In the beginning, the image was faint, indistinct. It was just an appreciation for his laugh, a sound like tumbling rocks that could fill our entire apartment. It was the way he'd push his glasses up his nose with his middle finger, a habit he was completely unaware of. It was the surprising gentleness with which he handled my delicate camera equipment if he ever had to move it, his large, capable hands suddenly filled with a careful reverence. But over time, the image began to sharpen. The lines became clearer, the contrast more defined. It happened in the quiet moments, the ones that existed between the frantic energy of his life and the still contemplation of mine. It was watching him fall asleep on the couch, his face finally losing its tense, problem-solving furrow, looking younger and impossibly vulnerable. It was the time he got a nasty flu, and I spent a weekend bringing him soup and tea, and in a fever-induced haze, he grabbed my hand and mumbled, "Thanks, Leo. You're the best." His hand was hot, his grip weak, but the contact sent a jolt through me that had nothing to do with static electricity. I hid it, of course. I buried it so deep I could barely find it myself. My feelings for Julian were a private collection of photographs, stored in a light-proof box in the darkroom of my heart. To bring them into the light felt like an unnecessary risk. Our friendship was a rare and precious thing, a perfectly balanced ecosystem. He was the sun, and I was the planet that quietly orbited him, content in the warmth of his gravitational pull. To confess my feelings would be to risk knocking us both out of our orbits, sending us spinning into a cold, empty void. What would I even be asking for? For him to change the very nature of who he was? In all the years I'd known him, his romantic interests had been a consistent parade of bright, bubbly, and decidedly female counterparts. There was Jessica in sophomore year, Emily in junior year, and most recently, Sarah, a 2-year relationship that had ended about 6 months before the laundry ritual began. Each of them had been lovely in their own way, and each time, I had played the role of the supportive best friend, listening to his stories of dates and romantic gestures, my own heart a quiet, aching drum in my chest. It was a familiar, manageable pain. It was the price of admission for getting to keep him in my life, and I was more than willing to pay it. So I built walls, not between us, but within myself. I constructed a perfect, soundproof room around my feelings, ensuring that no hint of them could ever escape and disrupt the careful peace of our home. After graduation, the decision to get an apartment together felt like the most natural thing in the world. He had a job offer from a demanding tech startup downtown, and I was starting to build a freelance photography career. We found a 2-bedroom place in a quiet neighborhood, a space with good light, which was my only real requirement. Our dynamic settled into a new, more adult rhythm. He would leave early, fueled by coffee and ambition, and often return late, his energy depleted, his shoulders slumped from hours spent hunched over a keyboard. I, on the other hand, lived a life of fluctuating schedules. Some days were spent in my room, which I had converted into a small studio and editing suite, losing hours in the digital darkroom of Photoshop. Other days I was out on shoots, capturing corporate headshots, edgy band promos, or the quiet, candid moments of a family portrait session. Our evenings were the constant. No matter how tired he was, Julian would always seek me out. He'd find me in the living room, surrounded by camera parts one was meticulously cleaning, and he'd collapse onto the other end of the couch with a long, world-weary sigh. He wouldn't always talk. Sometimes we would just sit there in the companionable silence. The only sounds the soft click of my cleaning tools and the hum of the city outside our window. His presence was a comfort, a grounding force. I was his harbor, the quiet place he could return to after battling the stormy seas of his professional life. I told myself that was enough. It had to be enough. The shift began subtly. It wasn't a single event, but a gradual change in atmospheric pressure. The breakup with Sarah had been amicable, a mutual recognition that they were heading in different directions. But its aftermath left a vacuum in Julian's life that he tried to fill with work. He started staying later at the office, taking on more projects, his ambition curdling into something that looked more like a desperate escape. The brilliant energy that had always defined him began to fray at the edges. He lost weight. Dark circles became permanent fixtures beneath his eyes. His laughter, once a constant, booming presence in our apartment, became a rare and precious commodity. He was running on fumes, and I was watching him slowly burn out. I tried to help in the only ways I knew how. I made sure there was always food in the fridge, often leaving a plate for him in the microwave for when he finally stumbled home at 10 or 11 at night. I kept the apartment clean and quiet, a sanctuary from the chaos of his job. I was the keeper of the lighthouse, making sure the light was always on, guiding him home. One Tuesday night, he came home looking utterly shattered. It was later than usual, past midnight, and I was in the living room, backing up files from a shoot. He didn't even say hello. He just dropped his messenger bag by the door with a heavy thud, walked over to the couch, and fell onto it face first. He lay there, motionless, for a full minute. I stopped my work, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. The silence in the room was heavy, thick with his exhaustion. Finally, his voice, muffled by a cushion, broke the quiet. "The whole server migration failed," he said. "The whole thing. Wiped out a week's worth of work for my entire team. And it was my code that did it." I didn't say anything. There were no words of technical comfort I could offer. So I just sat there, a silent witness to his misery. After another long silence, he rolled over onto his back and stared at the ceiling. "I'm just so tired, Leo," he whispered, and the sound of it broke my heart. It wasn't just physical exhaustion. It was a deep, soul-crushing weariness. He was a ship taking on water, and all the frantic bailing in the world wasn't helping. He was lonely. I could see it as clearly as a photograph. The absence of Sarah wasn't about missing her specifically anymore. It was about the absence of a partner, of an easy, physical comfort he had taken for granted. His life had become a stark landscape of work and stress, and our quiet apartment was the only place he had left to decompress. And he was starting to lean on me in ways that were new, ways that were beginning to test the structural integrity of the walls I had so carefully built. That night was a turning point. He started spending even more time in the common areas. He'd bring his laptop into the living room while I was editing, not to work, but just to be in the same space. He would sit there, endlessly scrolling through his phone, the blue light illuminating his tired face. He was seeking proximity, a silent reassurance that he wasn't alone. And then came the laundry. It was a Sunday afternoon. I was gathering my whites, the familiar, mundane start to my weekly routine. Julian was on the couch, wrapped in a blanket despite the mild weather, looking like he hadn't slept in days. He had been staring at the same spot on the wall for about 10 minutes. As I walked past with my hamper, he stirred. "Doing laundry?" he asked, his voice rough with disuse. I nodded. "Yeah, just the whites." He looked at my hamper, then in the direction of his own room, a deep sigh escaping his lips. "I have so much to do," he mumbled, more to himself than to me. "I don't think I have the energy to even get up." I paused at the door of the laundry room, my hand on the knob. I knew what was coming. I could feel the question forming in the air between us. "Hey, Leo," he said, his voice small. Would it be terrible if I just threw my stuff in with yours? I'm so behind on everything." My heart did a complicated, painful pirouette in my chest. It was such a simple request, a normal roommate request. But coming from him, in that moment, it felt like so much more. It felt like a test. It felt like a boundary being gently, tentatively pushed. Sharing a washing machine was one thing, but deliberately combining our clothes, our intimate, personal fabrics, it felt significant. My mind, the ever-present analyst, raced through the implications. The logical part of me said, "It's just laundry. Help your friend." But the other part, the part one kept locked in the darkroom, was screaming. It was a domestic act, an act of partnership, an act I had fantasized about in quiet, lonely moments. And now it was being offered to me, disguised as a gesture of convenience. To say no would be to reveal the strange, disproportionate weight I was placing on the act. It would be an admission that it meant more to me than it should. It would be a crack in my carefully constructed facade. So, I did the only thing I could. I swallowed the lump in my throat and forced a casual smile. "Yeah, of course, man. No problem. Just separate your colors." He gave me a weak but grateful smile, a flicker of the old Julian. "Thanks, Leo. You're a lifesaver." He disappeared into his room and returned a moment later with his own overflowing hamper, which he placed beside mine. And just like that, the border was crossed. The first time I did it, my hands felt clumsy, almost foreign. I stood in front of the two hampers, a mountain of white fabric. I reached into his and pulled out a t-shirt. It was soft, worn from 100 washes. I brought it to my face without thinking, a reflex. It smelled of him. That familiar, sharp citrus scent, mixed with the faint, musky aroma of a long day. It was the smell of his stress, his exhaustion, his very presence. My heart hammered against my ribs. This felt transgressive, like reading his diary. I quickly dropped the shirt into the machine and began grabbing handfuls from both hampers, mixing them together, trying to treat it with the detached efficiency it supposedly deserved. My socks next to his socks. My undershirts tangled with his. The whole process felt charged, electric. I poured in the detergent, my own unscented, hypoallergenic brand, and closed the lid. As the machine began to fill with water, the churning sound felt like a metaphor for the turmoil in my own gut. I had allowed him into a small, private part of my life, and now, in this very literal sense, we were being mixed, blended, and spun together. An hour later, as I was transferring the wet clothes to the dryer, the blended scent was already beginning to emerge. The heat of the dryer would amplify it, bake it into the fibers. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. While the clothes tumbled, I tried to distract myself, retreating to my room to edit photos. But I couldn't focus. My ears were attuned to the rhythmic thumping of the dryer down the hall. I was acutely aware of Julian, still on the couch, having fallen asleep to the sound of a documentary on television. He looked peaceful, his face slack in sleep, the blanket pulled up to his chin. He was trusting me, not just with his laundry, but with his vulnerability. He had brought his weariness to my doorstep, and I had let him in. When the dryer buzzed, the sound jolted me. I walked back to the laundry room and opened the door. A cloud of warm, fragrant steam billowed out, enveloping me. And there it was, the scent. It was perfectly balanced, a harmonious chord of sandalwood and citrus, underpinned by the clean, neutral smell of detergent. It was beautiful. It was the olfactory equivalent of our friendship, my quiet, grounding earthiness and his bright, vibrant energy merged into something new, something whole. I carried the basket of warm clothes into the living room and set it on the floor. The movement and the scent woke Julian. He blinked, stretching and yawning. "Is that done already?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep. "Yeah," I said, my own voice sounding distant to my ears. He sat up, rubbing his eyes behind his glasses. He reached into the basket and pulled out a t-shirt. It happened to be one of his. He held it for a moment. Then, just as I had done in secret, he brought it to his face and inhaled deeply. I held my breath. I watched as his expression changed. A small, thoughtful frown appeared between his eyebrows. He inhaled again, more slowly this time. "Huh," he said. He looked from the shirt to me, a strange, unreadable look in his eyes. "That's weird." My stomach plummeted. "Weird? What's weird? Did I use too much soap?" No, not that," he said quickly. He looked back at the shirt, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. He held it out to me. "Smell." It wasn't a request. It was a soft command. My hand trembled slightly as I took the shirt from him. I already knew what it smelled like. I had been obsessing over it for the past hour. But I lifted it to my face and pretended to be smelling it for the first time. I inhaled the scent of us. "What about it?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. He looked at me, his gaze direct and serious, and then he delivered the line that would become the cornerstone of this new, fragile architecture we were building. "They smell better mixed together," he said, his voice quiet. Like home, or something. Home." The word hung in the air between us, shimmering with unspoken meaning. It was a word I had never, in my wildest dreams, expected to hear from him in this context. Home wasn't a place. It was a feeling. It was safety. It was comfort. It was belonging. And he had just associated that feeling with the scent of us, combined. My carefully constructed walls didn't just crack, they shuddered. I didn't know what to say. My entire vocabulary seemed to have evaporated in the warm, fragrant air. So I just nodded, a stupid, jerky movement, and began to fold the clothes, my hands moving on autopilot. He watched me for a moment, then reached into the basket and started folding, too. We sat there on the floor of our living room, folding our mixed-together laundry in a silence that was heavier and more charged than any silence we had ever shared before. Every time my hand brushed against his as we both reached for a sock, a spark of electricity shot up my arm. I was hyper-aware of his proximity, of the way his knee was only inches from mine, of the sound of his breathing. This simple, domestic chore had become the most intensely intimate experience of my life. That was the beginning of the ritual. The following Sunday, I didn't even have to ask. As I was gathering my laundry, Julian appeared at his bedroom door, his own hamper in hand. He didn't offer an excuse about being tired or busy this time. He just looked at me, a silent question in his eyes. I gave a small nod, and he brought his hamper out and placed it next to mine. It was an unspoken agreement. This was our new normal. Every week, the ritual repeated. The mixing of the clothes, the churning of the machine, the warm, fragrant cloud of steam from the dryer. And then, the folding. We would always do it together, usually on the living room floor, sometimes with a movie playing in the background that neither of us was watching. The conversation was minimal. We didn't need to talk. The act itself was the conversation. It was a weekly reaffirmation of the strange, delicate bond that was growing between us. "They smell better mixed together," the phrase echoed in my mind every time I opened the dryer. It had become our mantra, the unofficial motto of Apartment 2B. My obsession with the ritual grew. As a photographer, I am trained to notice details, to find meaning in the mundane. And I brought the full force of my analytical mind to bear on our laundry. I cataloged the subtle shifts. The way he started buying the same brand of socks as me, so that when they were folded and piled together, it was impossible to tell whose were whose. The time I found one of my hoodies in his closet, and when I pointed it out, he just shrugged and said, "It's the comfiest one," as if it were the most natural thing in the world for him to be wearing my clothes. The ritual began to bleed into other areas of our lives. He started falling asleep on the couch more often, not from exhaustion anymore, but from a kind of deep, peaceful contentment. He would be there, supposedly watching a movie with me, and I would look over and find him asleep, his head lolling towards my shoulder. The first time it happened, I froze. My every instinct screamed at me to close the small distance, to let his head rest on my shoulder. But I couldn't. The fear of being presumptuous, of misreading the signal, was too great. So I would just sit there, rigid, until my own neck ached. Then I would gently wake him and tell him to go to bed. One night, he didn't wake up. He just slumped over, his head landing softly on my shoulder. My entire body went rigid. I could feel the warmth of him through my t-shirt. I could smell the faint scent of his shampoo. His breathing was a slow, deep rhythm against my collarbone. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, every nerve ending firing. This was a new threshold. The laundry was one thing. It was contained, indirect. This was direct physical contact, initiated by him, albeit in sleep. My mind raced. Should I move him? Should I wake him up? Or should I just stay? The temptation to stay, to accept this small, unconscious gift of intimacy, was overwhelming. It was everything I had ever wanted, offered to me in a way that allowed for perfect, plausible deniability. He was just asleep. He didn't mean anything by it. But I would know. I would know what it felt like to have him rest on me, to have him trust me with his unconscious self. So I stayed. I sat there on that couch for 2 hours, my arm falling asleep, my back cramping, until the movie ended and the screen went black, plunging the room into darkness. And in that quiet, dark room, with the weight of him on my shoulder, I felt a sense of peace so profound it almost made me want to weep. I was his harbor. I was his home. These moments of accidental intimacy became more frequent. The lines were blurring so much they were beginning to disappear. Our apartment, once a space of two separate lives coexisting, was becoming a single, shared territory. My camera bags lived next to his work bag by the door. His stray socks appeared in my room. We stopped thinking in terms of mine and yours. It was all ours, our couch, our coffee maker, our ridiculously fragrant laundry. For me, it was a dream come true, a fantasy I was living in but couldn't fully claim. For Julian, I had no idea what it was. His surface-level confidence had returned, the deep weariness had lifted from his eyes, but it was replaced by something else, something I couldn't quite decipher. A kind of quiet restlessness. I would catch him looking at me sometimes, when he thought I wasn't paying attention. It was the same look he had given me that first night with the laundry, a look of thoughtful, confused curiosity. It was the look of a man trying to solve a puzzle without realizing he was one of the pieces. I lived in a state of perpetual, low-grade anxiety, a tight coil of hope and fear in my stomach. Every day felt like I was walking a tightrope. On one side was the quiet, lonely safety of the friendship we used to have. On the other side was something else, something I desperately wanted but was terrified to name. And I was suspended in the middle, afraid to move forward, unable to go back. The laundry ritual continued, the constant, rhythmic beat of our new life. It was my anchor in this sea of ambiguity. No matter how confusing the day had been, no matter how many times I had caught him watching me with that unreadable expression, I knew that on Sunday, we would mix our clothes, and for a few hours, everything would feel right. We would sit on the floor, the warm, clean scent of us filling the air, and the simple, shared task of folding would be a temporary balm to my frayed nerves. It was a fragile piece, but it was all I had. The crossing happened on a rainy Tuesday in October. It wasn't even a laundry night. The day had been dreary, the sky a uniform, depressing gray. I had spent the day cooped up inside, editing a series of portraits that felt lifeless and uninspired. Julian came home early, soaked from the rain. He shed his wet coat and shoes at the door and trudged into the living room, running a hand through his damp hair. "I hate this weather," he grumbled, collapsing onto the couch. "It makes everything feel slow." I hummed in agreement, not looking up from my laptop. We sat in silence for a while, the only sound the gentle drumming of the rain against the window panes. The air in the apartment felt heavy, charged with the melancholy of the weather. Julian was uncharacteristically fidgety. He kept picking up his phone, unlocking it, and then locking it again without looking at anything. Finally, he let out a frustrated sigh and tossed the phone onto the cushion beside him. "Do you want to watch a movie?" he asked. "Sure," I said, grateful for the distraction. We had a collection of old DVDs, relics from a time before streaming, that we sometimes liked to revisit. He got up and started browsing the shelf. He pulled one out. "How about this one?" he asked, holding it up. It was a quiet, indie romance, one of my favorites, a film we had watched together back in college. It was a story about two people who spend a single night walking and talking, falling in love in the spaces between their words. It felt like a loaded choice. "Okay," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He put the disc in, and the familiar opening scenes filled the screen. We settled onto the couch, a respectable distance between us. But as the movie progressed, the space began to shrink. It was an unconscious magnetic pull. A shared laugh would bring our heads closer together. A poignant scene would make him shift his weight, his arm brushing against mine. By the midpoint of the film, we were sitting so close our thighs were touching, a line of warmth and pressure from hip to knee. I was acutely aware of every point of contact. My entire consciousness seemed to have narrowed to the few square inches of fabric where his jeans met mine. The dialogue of the film faded into a background hum. The only sound I could truly hear was the frantic beating of my own heart. I kept my eyes glued to the screen, terrified that if I looked at him, he would see everything on my face. The movie reached its climax, a scene of quiet, heart-wrenching confession. The male lead, a man as quiet and reserved as myself, finally tells the woman how he feels. It's not a grand declaration, but a simple, whispered admission of vulnerability. On the screen, the characters were leaning towards each other, the space between them crackling with unspoken tension. I chanced to glance at Julian. He wasn't watching the movie anymore. He was watching me. His face was illuminated by the flickering light of the television, his expression one of intense, raw emotion. The thoughtful, confused look was gone, replaced by something clearer, something more certain. And it terrified me. I quickly looked back at the screen, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "Leo," he said, his voice so quiet I almost didn't hear it over the movie's soundtrack. I didn't answer. I couldn't. "Leo," he said again, a little louder this time. Slowly, I turned my head to face him. We were so close. I could see the flecks of green in his hazel eyes. I could see the faint scar above his eyebrow from a childhood accident. I could feel his breath on my cheek, warm and smelling faintly of the coffee he'd had hours ago. The world seemed to shrink until it was only the few inches of space between our faces. He didn't lean in. He just watched my face, his eyes searching mine. It felt like he was waiting for a signal, for permission. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. The movie ended, the credits rolling in the background, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across his face. He swallowed, a visible bob of his Adam's apple. "Would it be okay?" he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. I knew what he was asking. He was asking if it was okay to cross the final boundary, to tear down the last remaining wall. He was asking if it was okay to kiss me. My own walls, the ones I had so carefully maintained for 4 years, crumbled into dust. All the fear, all the anxiety, all the carefully rehearsed lines of denial, they all vanished. In their place was a simple, overwhelming truth. Yes, it would be more than okay. It would be everything. But I couldn't find the words. So I just gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. That was all the confirmation he needed. He closed the remaining distance between us, his movement agonizingly slow, tentative. It wasn't a kiss of passion or demand. It was a question. His lips were soft, hesitant against mine. It was a gentle pressure, a moment of quiet discovery. It lasted for only a second, maybe two, and then he pulled back, his eyes still closed, his forehead resting against mine. We stayed like that, breathing the same air, our hearts beating in a frantic, unsynchronized rhythm. Then he opened his eyes. "Oh," he said, his voice a breath of sound. It wasn't a happy, "oh," it was a confused, startled, "oh." It was the sound of someone who had just walked through a door and found himself in a room he didn't recognize. And in that single, small sound, all of my fear came rushing back in, a cold, tidal wave. The beautiful, fragile moment shattered. He pulled away completely, scrambling to the other end of the couch, putting a sudden, shocking chasm of space between us. He ran a hand through his hair, his breathing ragged. He wouldn't look at me. I'm sorry, he stammered, his eyes fixed on his own hands, which were clenched into tight fists in his lap. I shouldn't have. I don't know what. I have to go before I could say a word. He was on his feet and practically running to his room, closing the door behind him with a soft but definitive click. The sound echoed in the silent apartment like a gunshot. I sat there, frozen on the couch, for a long time. The credits on the television had finished, and the menu screen was now playing on a loop, its cheerful, repetitive music a mocking counterpoint to the deafening silence in my heart. I touched my lips. They still tingled from the brief contact. The kiss had been real. But his reaction, his panic, his flight, it had all but erased it. It felt like I had dreamt the whole thing. I replayed the moment over and over in my mind. A photographer examining a flawed print, looking for the exact point where it all went wrong. The way he looked at me. His whispered question, "Why not?" The tentative touch of his lips. And then, that one, small, devastating word. I had misinterpreted everything. The laundry, the couch sleeping, the stolen glances. I had built a grand, romantic narrative out of a series of coincidences and convenient gestures born of his loneliness and my proximity. He hadn't been falling for me. He had just been falling. And I had been there to catch him. I wasn't his home. I was just a port in a storm. And now the storm was passing, and he had realized, with dawning horror, that he was docked in a very strange and unfamiliar harbor. The pain was a physical thing, a hollow ache in the center of my chest. It was worse than the years of quiet, unrequited longing. That was a dull, manageable ache. This was a sharp, searing wound. Because for a few, beautiful, fleeting seconds, I had had it. I had tasted it. And now it was gone. The next morning, the apartment was silent. Too silent. I woke up early, my body stiff from having fallen asleep on the couch. Julian's door was still closed. I made coffee, my movements slow and heavy, as if I were moving through water. I waited. 8 o'clock came and went, the time he usually left for work. Then 9 o'clock. At 9:30, I heard a sound from his room. Not the sound of him getting ready, but the faint, tinny sound of his phone. A few minutes later, my own phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text from him. "Hey, not feeling great. Going to work from home today. Will probably just stay in my room so I can focus." It was the most sterile, corporate-sounding text I had ever received from him. Stay in my room so I can focus. He wasn't building a wall. He was barricading himself behind it. The message was clear: leave me alone. Let's pretend last night never happened. A cold fury, sharp and surprising, cut through my misery. I wasn't angry at him for being confused. I was angry at him for his cowardice. For years, I had been the quiet, stable one, the one who absorbed his chaos and gave him a safe space. And now, the one time I needed him to be brave, to face something uncomfortable, he was hiding. He was treating me like a mistake he had to erase. The day was torture. I was a prisoner in my own home, hyper-aware of the man hiding in the room down the hall. Every creak of the floorboards, every cough, every faint sound from his room sent a jolt of anxiety through me. I tried to work, but the photographs on my screen were just meaningless pixels. The silence between us was a living thing, a malevolent entity that grew larger with each passing hour, sucking all the air out of the apartment. It was so much worse than an argument. An argument would have been a connection, a sign that we were still in this together. This silence was an erasure. By evening, I couldn't take it anymore. The hollow ache in my chest had been replaced by a hard, unyielding knot of frustration. He was going to make me the villain of this story, the one who had taken advantage of his vulnerability. He was going to let my nod, my silent consent, be the thing that broke us. I wouldn't let him. Our friendship, our 4 years of history, deserved more than a cowardly retreat into silence. It deserved the truth, no matter how messy or painful that truth was. I stood up from my desk, my decision made. I walked down the hall and stood in front of his closed door. My heart was hammering, but my hand was steady as I knocked. There was a long pause. Then, his voice, strained and wary. "Yeah, Julian, we need to talk," I said, my own voice firmer than I expected. Another pause. "I'm really busy, Leo. Can it wait?" "No," I said, the word sharp, uncompromising. "It can't." I heard a sigh, the sound of a man resigning himself to the inevitable. Then the sound of footsteps, and the door opened a crack. He stood there, blocking the entrance, his arms crossed over his chest. He looked terrible. His eyes were red-rimmed, and he hadn't shaved. "What?" he asked, his tone defensive. "I'm not going to do this," I said, keeping my voice low and even. "I'm not going to pretend that last night didn't happen. And I'm not going to let you hide in your room and pretend I don't exist. You owe me more than that. We owe us more than that." His defensive posture faltered. A flicker of guilt, of shame, crossed his face. "Leo, I know," I interrupted, holding up a hand. "Let me finish. For 4 years, I have been your friend. I have been your constant. I have been the person you came to when your world was falling apart. And I have never, not once, asked for anything in return. But I'm asking for something now. I am asking for the truth. I don't care if it's messy or confusing or if it makes you uncomfortable. I want to know what's going on in your head. Because this," I said, gesturing to the closed door, to the suffocating silence between us, "this is killing me. And it's not fair." He stared at me, his mouth slightly open. The fight seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a deep, weary sadness. He leaned his forehead against the doorframe, closing his eyes. "I'm so sorry, Leo," he whispered. "You're right. It's not fair." He opened the door wider. "Come in." His room was dark, the only light coming from his laptop screen, which was displaying a spreadsheet that he clearly hadn't been looking at. Clothes were strewn on the floor. An empty coffee mug sat on his nightstand. It was the room of a man under siege. He sat on the edge of his bed, and I took the desk chair, the space between us feeling like a mile-wide canyon. "I don't know what's wrong with me," he began, his voice raw. "Last night, when I kissed you, it felt right. It felt more right than anything has felt in a very long time. Hope, a small, treacherous bird, fluttered in my chest. But then," he continued, "the second it was over, I just panicked. It was like my brain short-circuited. All these alarms started going off. This is wrong. This isn't you. What are you doing?" He looked up at me, his eyes pleading for understanding. I've never felt that way about a guy before, Leo. I've never even considered it. My whole life, I've had a blueprint, you know? Go to school, get a good job, meet a nice girl, get married. And you're not in the blueprint. So I'm a deviation from the plan?" I asked, my voice softer now, the anger replaced by a familiar ache. "No," he said, shaking his head vehemently. You're my best friend. You're the person I want to talk to at the end of a bad day. You're the person whose quiet presence in a room makes me feel less alone. For the past 6 months, since Sarah and I broke up. No, longer than that. You've been the most important person in my life. And I've been leaning on you, taking all this comfort and support you give so freely, and I never once stopped to think about what it all meant." He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. "When we started doing the laundry together, it was a joke at first, just an excuse because I was too lazy. But then, that smell, our things, mixed together, it smelled like safety. And I started to crave it. I started to crave you. You're quiet, you're calm. And I didn't understand it. I didn't want to look at it too closely. I just knew I needed it." He looked up, his eyes wet. "And last night, when I kissed you, it was like all the pieces suddenly clicked into place. And the picture they made, it scared the hell out of me. Because it wasn't the picture I thought I was supposed to have. And my first instinct was to run, to blame you, or blame myself, and just burn the whole thing down so I wouldn't have to deal with it. I listened, my own heart aching in sympathy for his turmoil. All the confusion, the fear, the panic. It was all so clear to me now. He hadn't been running from me. He had been running from himself. From a version of himself he didn't recognize. I stood up and walked over to the bed, sitting down next to him, leaving a careful foot of space between us. "Julian," I said gently. "Look at me." He lifted his head. "There is no blueprint," I said. "That's the secret they don't tell you. We're all just making it up as we go along. We're all just trying to find our way home." I took a deep breath, preparing to finally bring my own secrets out of the darkroom. "For me, this isn't new. This feeling. I've been in love with you for years." His eyes widened, his mouth falling open in shock. "What?" "It's true," I said, a strange sense of peace settling over me now that the words were out. I just got very, very good at hiding it. Because our friendship was too important to risk. You were too important to risk. I was content to live in the orbit you created, just happy to be near you. And if last night was a mistake, if it was just a moment of confusion for you, I can accept that. I can go back to being your friend. It will hurt, but I will do it. Because the thought of not having you in my life at all, that's unbearable. I looked him straight in the eye. "But you have to tell me the truth. Not the truth you think you're supposed to feel, but the truth of what you do feel. Right now? In this moment." He stared at me, his mind clearly reeling from my confession. He opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked down at his hands, then back at me. He was a man standing at a crossroads, with one path leading back to the familiar, comfortable life he had always imagined, and the other leading into a wild, uncharted territory. And I was standing at the entrance to that wilderness, waiting. "I'm scared," he finally whispered, his voice small and childlike. "I know," I said. "I am too. I don't know what this means," he said. "I don't know who I am if you're Julian," I said simply. "And I'm Leo. That's all we have to be right now. We don't have to label it. We don't have to put it in a box. We just have to not run away from it." I slowly, tentatively, reached out and took his hand. His fingers were cold, but they curled around mine, his grip surprisingly strong. We sat there, in the quiet, messy room, just holding hands. It wasn't a passionate or romantic gesture. It was a lifeline. It was two people in the middle of a storm, clinging to each other. "Okay," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He squeezed my hand. "Okay." The days that followed were strange and delicate. We were like two people learning to walk again after a long illness. Our movements around each other were careful, tentative. We were constantly checking in, not with words, but with looks, with small gestures. A shared smile over our morning coffee. The way he would brush his hand against my back as he passed me in the narrow hallway. The tension was gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful tenderness. We didn't kiss again. It felt too soon, too much. We were rebuilding our foundation, and this time, we were doing it together, with full honesty. We were laying each brick with care, making sure it was solid before we added the next. The biggest test came the following Sunday. Laundry day. The air was thick with unspoken questions. Was the ritual over? Was it a relic of the ambiguous time before? Something we had to leave behind? I gathered my clothes, my heart heavy with uncertainty. As I walked towards the laundry room, Julian's door opened. He stood there, his own hamper in his hands. He didn't say a word. He just looked at me, a small, shy smile on his face. He walked over and placed his hamper next to mine. It wasn't a gesture of convenience or habit anymore. It was a choice. It was a statement. It was him saying, "I'm still here. I'm not running." We did the laundry together, just like always. But this time, it was different. There was no anxiety, no frantic internal monologue on my part. Just a quiet, shared sense of purpose. When the clothes were done, warm and fragrant with our combined scent, we carried the basket into the living room. We sat on the floor, side by side, our knees touching. And we folded. And as we folded, we talked. We talked about his fears, about the pressure he felt to live up to some imaginary ideal. We talked about my years of silence, about the loneliness of loving someone from a distance. We unwound all the tangled threads of our miscommunication and misunderstanding, laying them out straight and clean, like the freshly folded t-shirts we were piling between us. It was in the middle of folding a pair of our now indistinguishable socks that he paused. He looked at the sock in his hand, then at me. "You know," he said, his voice thoughtful. "I think I figured something out." "What's that?" I asked. "Home isn't a blueprint," he said, a slow, beautiful smile spreading across his face. "It's a scent. and it smells like sandalwood and citrus. And then he leaned over, and he kissed me. It was as gentle and tentative as the first time, but there was no panic in it. There was no fear. There was only a quiet, certain rightness. It was a kiss that tasted of hope and warm cotton and the promise of a new beginning. We began to heal in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together. The apartment, once a stage for our unspoken anxieties, became a genuine sanctuary. The open doors between our rooms were no longer signs of ambiguity, but of trust. The rhythm of our lives found a new, more synchronized beat. It wasn't a grand, sweeping romance that erupted from that point. It was something quieter, deeper, and infinitely more precious. It was in the small, mundane moments that our love story was written. It was in the way he started making me a cup of tea, just the way I liked it, before he left for work in the morning. It was in the way I started saving him the last of the good light in my studio, knowing he loved to read by the window in the late afternoon. It was the easy, unconscious way our hands would find each other when we were sitting on the couch, our fingers lacing together as if they had been doing it their whole lives. The fear didn't vanish overnight. There were still moments of uncertainty for Julian, moments where I would see a flicker of the old panic in his eyes. But now, instead of running, he would turn to me. He would take my hand and just breathe, grounding himself in the reality of us. And I, in turn, learned to let go of my own anxieties, to trust in the solidity of what we were building. I learned that love didn't have to be a secret collection of photographs, hidden away in the dark. It could be something living, breathing, something that could withstand the light of day. The laundry ritual continued, a comforting and constant touchstone in our new life. It was no longer a source of tension, but a celebration. A weekly reminder of how our two separate lives had been irrevocably, beautifully blended into one. And every time I pulled a warm shirt from the dryer and held it to my face, inhaling that familiar, perfect scent of sandalwood and citrus, I would be reminded that the most profound and life-altering changes often don't arrive with a bang. They arrive quietly, disguised as a load of laundry, smelling, simply and wonderfully, like home.